Okay, myself Dr. Neelam J. Gupta on behalf of CSR CRRI and on my own behalf, welcome you all to this live talk on the occasion of World Environment Day. Our today's chief guest is Dr. Deepak Apte, Director, Bombay Natural History Society. We are extremely happy and delighted to have you, sir. Every year, there is a theme decided for the World Environment Day. This year, the theme is Celebrate Biodiversity. The theme is extremely relevant because human beings are part of the ecosystem and cannot continue to survive in isolation. With the world fighting a pandemic together and most countries in lockdown, the environment seemed to have benefited slightly and nature seemed to have been busy reclaiming its spaces. To speak more about today's event, I invite Dr. Anuradha Shukla for her introductory address. Ma'am, please.
Thank you, Dr. Neelam. Respected Dr. Deepak Apte, Director BNHS, who is also our esteemed speaker today, Professor Satish Chandra, Director CRRI, and dear colleagues. I'm going to give a brief overview of environment-related research activities done in CRRI. Environment and Road Traffic Safety Division, that is ERTS division, was first established in 1986 in CRRI, which was later renamed as Transport Planning and Environment Division. We were first one in India to procure mobile air pollution monitoring van way back in 1986. Apart from air pollution laboratory, we have well-equipped noise and vibration lab. Recently, we established nanomaterial laboratory, which we plan to upgrade as Center of Excellence for Research on linkages between nanomaterial, environment, and road transport. Some of the significant studies linking road traffic, environment, and health done by CRRI are effect of environmental pollution due to road traffic on health of Delhi traffic policemen in 1989. This study was first comprehensive study in Delhi to consider human health and pollution interplay in collaboration with All India Institute of Medical Sciences and traffic police personnels. And in this study, we took two groups of traffic police persons. One were exposed group, which were working in a heavy traffic intersection for more than 5 years, and other group was posted at office for more than 5 years. So after their lung function study, carbon monoxide in blood, carbon monoxide in breath, and measurement of pollutant level at these intersections, we suggested that the traffic police persons who were posted at intersection, they should be rotated after every 3 hours. And another suggestion was that traffic police personnel at these intersections should wear masks. So this study and picture of policemen wearing masks was widely publicized in media, which was kind of novelty some 30 years back. Urban road traffic and air pollution in major. The important study was urban air pollution and air in major metropolitan cities in India, which was done way back in 2002. This was done at the behest of National Auto Fuel Policy Committee. This comprehensive study was first in India to estimate and quantify traffic and associated pollution loads from vehicles, and this assisted in deriving national auto fuel policy for various cities in India to quantify the emissions and their reductions due to different measures. Then one study which we did was on atmospheric aerosol and trace gases under ISRO Geosphere Biosphere Road Campaign. This was mega collaborative study involving 70 scientists from 19 laboratories in India to study atmospheric aerosols and trace gases across the Indo-Gangetic plain in northern India. Coming to recent studies, a reduction in emission loads due to Eastern Peripheral Expressways was studied, and the aim was to see if there is reduction in pollution in Delhi NCR due to this opening of this Eastern Peripheral Expressway. Presently, we are studying the health impact of Delhi Metro and impact of traffic on health among school children in Delhi in collaboration with Indian Institute of Health Management and Research. So while talking on transport and health, though transport has brought the world closer with well-developed transport system, which provides easy connectivity, accessibility and mobility at not only local levels, but also at the global levels. But the negative impacts of this mobility is that it has led to the COVID virus to spread not only locally, but countrywide and eventually globally in a very short span of time. So, on other hand, this provides us the opportunity to plan and shift towards the walking and cycling and develop sustainable transport system. There is a need for more focused research on transport, environment, and health linkages so as to derive positive changes, as in future there is a possibility of this kind of pandemic to reoccur again. So to end on positive note, this pandemic has forced us to go for virtual mobility, thus reducing the travel time, reducing air pollution, noise pollution, and thus we have more time for nature, which is also the focus of the theme of this year's Environment Day. Thank you. Over to Neelam.
Thank you, ma'am. Now I request Director CRRI, Professor Satish Chandra, for his welcome address.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Neelam and Dr. Anwar Shukla. A very warm welcome to all of you, and particularly I am thankful to Dr. Deepak Apte, who has agreed to my request to be with us today virtually, and I hope that after this fear of coronavirus is over, we will meet in personal capacity also. As told by Dr. Neelam, the theme of this Environment Day is Celebrate Biodiversity. And I'm repeating what basically she made the statement that this theme is extremely relevant because human beings are part of ecosystem and cannot continue to survive in isolation. Now this biodiversity is important for survival of all living things, big and small, on land or in water. And we need to understand that while there may be a food chain and ranking of species, every living thing is connected to another living thing. And together they form a network of diverse life forms on this planet. I am extremely happy, friends, that today we have with us Dr. Deepak Apte, who has extensively worked in biodiversity, and he is probably the fittest person to talk on biodiversity today. Before I invite him for his lecture, I would just briefly introduce Dr. Deepak Apte to the audience here. Dr. Deepak Apte holds a doctorate in geology with a specialization in marine ecology. He received post-graduation degree in the field of geology from University of Mumbai, integrated coastal zone management from AIT Bangkok, and marine policy from Duke University, USA. Dr. Deepak is currently the director of Bombay Natural History Society, India. He is a recipient of the prestigious Green Oscar Whiteley Award and the Whiteley Continuation Award for his work on giant clams in Lakshadweep, Andaman and Nicobar Islands. He has also been awarded a global fellowship in marine conservation by the Duke University, USA. Dr. Deepak is a fellow of Lead India and International Visitors Program of USA. He is recipient of Vasundhara Green Teacher Award and Rotary Award for Environmental Conservation. A well-received author, Dr. Deepak has to his credit 5 books and more than 60 scientific papers in field of coastal and marine biodiversity in the prestigious journals like Nature, Evolution, Ecological Indicators, Journal of Natural History, and so on and so on. He is an accomplished underwater photographer with over 5,000 hours of diving experience. Dr. Deepak is a member of several key committees in the Government of India. Just to name a few, he is a member of National Board of Wildlife, Chairman of Environmental Appraisal Committee on CRJ and Infrastructure of Ministry of Environment and Forest, member of Monitoring Evaluation Committee of MOEF, and Bird Control Committee of Ministry of Civil Aviation. He is a member of State Wild Boards of Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, and Andaman and Nicobar, Governing Council member of SECON, Wildlife Institute of India Society and Mangrove Foundation, and member of Maharashtra State, Kampa. He is a member of Coral Reef and Mangrove Committee of Government of Gujarat, Core Group on Flamingo City World Heritage Site, and Central Asia Flyway Committee of Ministry of Environment and Forest. Dr. Deepak is also the executive member of SECON, Mangrove Foundation of Maharashtra National Vulture Recovery Program, and trustee of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya. Currently, he is supervising several large programs including Himalaya, climate change and threatened species, wetlands and bird flyways, and coastal and marine program. 3 students are currently pursuing PhD under his supervision at University of Mumbai, and 1 student at Manipal Academy of Higher Education, Karnataka. His wildlife career spans over 30 years, and he has contributed immensely to develop several policies at national level. And friends, you will be happy to note that a new species of burrow snake, which was discovered in November last year in Arunachal Pradesh, has been named after Dr. Apte, and that is Trachycum apte. With these words, I invite Dr. Apte to deliver his keynote address, please.
Thank you, sir, for very elaborate introduction. Am I audible to everybody?
Yes.
And are the slides visible? Are the slides visible to everybody?
Yes. Slides are not visible yet.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, visible.
Okay. Happy Environment Day. I think we should have every day as Environment Day, not just one day, because as Mr. Chandraji rightly said, we are so connected to nature and environment. Before I go to my core presentation, I just want to give a very brief background of bit of BNHS and bit of why today we are at such a perilous state, rather in a conflict state with environment. Now, Bombay Natural History Society is the oldest wildlife conservation organization globally. We started in 1883, so we are 137 years young institution. Our area primarily is important landscape, seascape and species. We have about 270 scientists work across 23 field stations pan-India. We have a lovely naturalistic collection, and I do invite all of you at some point of time to visit our Mumbai office to see this beautiful collection. About 135,000 specimens, well preserved, which spans to our almost 200-year-old collection. We have 3 environmental education units, one in Mumbai, one in Nagpur, and one in Delhi. And do visit our education center in Asola Bhatti, where we do a lot of environmental education program for all sections of society. And we have a major policy advocacy division within BNHS, which works with central government and various state governments on structural reforms on some of the key policies of Government of India and state governments. I think before we even go to speak about biodiversity, we need to understand that we are blessed actually with where we are currently geographically. We are among top 10 globally important biodiversity biodiversity hotspot. And biodiversity of India composed about 7% of world's known life. Now that's a remarkable kind of natural repository that we have. We are custodian with, and that essentially happens because of wide array of habitats that we find in this beautiful country, all the way from Jammu Kashmir to south in Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and from east to west, right from evergreen tropical forest to rain forest to deciduous forest to moist evergreen forest, then different types of grasslands, tall grasslands of Gangetic plains and Brahmaputra plains to short grasslands of Central India, beautiful deserts. A lot of people say it's a barren land. It's not actually a barren land. It's one of the most spectacular ecosystem that we have. And then snow-clad mountains in terms of terrestrial landscape. And in a watery domain, we have a lovely 8,000-kilometer coastline, which includes some of the most beautiful reefs of Andaman, Nicobar, and Lakshadweep. Then we have inland wetlands, we have coastal wetland, lovely mangrove forest, and the range of intertidal habitats spread across length and breadth of this country. Now, with this diversity of various types of ecosystem, is a key factor that we have so much of both land and water diversity. If I have to look at the broad canvas for our landscape and marinescape, I would say there are broadly about 9 key ecotones that we talk about, from Himalaya, Tarai grassland, arid and semi-arid grassland, then Central Indian plains, Western Ghats, islands, coastal areas, and wetlands. Besides that, of course, there are some other key aspects, but I think this is by and large 9. A broad canvas covers a majority of the biodiversity, and plus the Eastern Ghats, of course, which I forget to mention. We also have in a marine domain about 9 critical areas spread across this country. From Gujarat, we have 2, Gulf of Kutch, Gulf of Khambat. Maharashtra, we have one in Karnataka, which is Netrani, Gulf of Karwar. We have Gulf of in Tamil Nadu, Bhitarkanika in Orissa, and Sundarban in West Bengal, and plus islands of Lakshadweep and Andaman Nicobar. But besides these 9 critical areas, we have roughly about 200 ecologically sensitive areas in coastal and marine domain across through very extensive study done by a number of institutions like Wildlife Institute of India, ZSI, BNHS, and so on and so forth. These collectively, both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem provides us number of ecosystem services, which we usually don't recognize them to its full extent in terms of the fresh water that our forest provides, or the carbon sequestration our forest do, the fresh breathable oxygen and air that our forests produce, the range of ecosystem services that oceans provide us remain by and large ignored. And one of the most stark example I can give of this ignorance and rather poor use of ecosystem budgeting approach is, for example, 1 hectare of a tropical rainforest in Arunachal today fetch only, in terms of what we call it as net present value, about 10.30 lakh. I mean, that's how ridiculous we are in terms of recognizing the value of pristine forest that we have. We have to understand why this conflict today exists in the conservation domain. These 2 slides, one on the right hand side gives you a broad canvas of the kind of forest types that we have, last remaining forest pockets. And if you can see my cursor, then you will see it mostly it is into the Himalayan region, to Northeast India, to the Central Indian region that includes Maharashtra, part of Madhya Pradesh, and some of other areas of Bihar, Uttar Pradesh. And then we have got the Western Ghats, which is again a very beautiful mountain, very old mountain range. And if you look at the last remaining resources that currently we are trying to harvest through, our hydro potential, if you see the middle slide on the left hand side with these white dots, the entire hydropower potential is in Himalaya and Northeast India. If you look at the lower image on the left hand side, all our last remaining coal reserves and iron ore reserves are having complete overlap with our last remaining forest. So what happened over the course of last 5 years? We already are almost fully exploited resources. Now, whatever resources today we are having, those are within this last remaining forest pocket. And therefore, therefore, no matter what you do and where you want to develop your business, extractive industry business, you will have an absolute conflict with conservation of these habitats and species, because there is nothing else outside this remain for us to harvest further. Now, this overlap is a great cause of concern. How then you will strike a balance between development and conservation is going to be a humongous challenge for us as a nation, and we need to look at that very, very seriously. Because if we compromise of all these last remaining forest and habitat, then there's nothing left for us to speak and to conserve about.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah,
Can
sorry.
you put in the slide mode?
Sir, I cannot do that, unfortunately. Can you see this?
Yeah, we are able to see, but it's not coming in the slide mode.
Yeah, that's the
No,
problem that
cannot.
I'm facing for this Microsoft Teams.
Okay, sir.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
This scenario we have for our coastal development, and this is not the garland around our beautiful country. These are all projects that are either have come up, which already got ECN operational, and there are a number of projects awaiting various stages of clearance, whether at state level or central level. Now that includes shipyards, coastal mining, resource mining, or whether these are power plants, whether it's petrochemical or nuclear or thermal, plus there are sea walls and the whole range. Now this is an exercise we did in 2010. It took us 2 years to document every single resource or structure that we have or industry we have, and its information is available online with this web portal. Now that's a very scary situation, because if we have this kind of investment interest, or rather I would say that already few investment and additional investment interest, then we have to look at sea level rise very, very seriously. Otherwise, all these investments and people staying therein will have a huge risk of facing the brunt of climate change. I will speak about a little bit about this through 6 case studies. I'm not going to take too much of time. I'm going to probably dwell upon these 6 case studies to see, to rather explain how divorced we are today from science of conservation vis-a-vis policy. And that's exactly what our dilemma is, that there is a great degree of science available, but our policy does not take into account these scientific inputs. So we do better management. So these are the 6 case studies I'm going to speak about. Olive Ridley's turtles, sea turtles on the east coast of India. Urban biodiversity, that all of us well aware is very close to our heart. Human wildlife conflict, and zoonotic is one part of human wildlife conflict. Bird migration, again a very interesting phenomena. The linear projects and wildlife, probably more interesting for CRRI point of view, because you directly deal with some of these issues every day, and the climate change. I'll go through the first case study of olive ridley turtle. Now, India is a remarkable country so far as this species is concerned. We get about 1 million female olive ridley sea turtles coming every year for nesting in Orissa. And these are not the stones or rocks you see on the beach. These are all female sea turtles come ashore every day for a span of about 2 to 3 weeks to lay more than 50 to 60 million eggs annually in this coast. The phenomena called as rookery. These are called as the rookery. And there are 3 places, 3 beaches in Orissa where these turtles nest. One is Bhitarkanika, then there is a Devi Mouth and a Rishikulya Mouth. And this is one project which Anuradhaji will remember. We fought tooth and nail to not allow EC for this 8-lane highway passing very close to some of the important catchment of and flood plains of some of these areas. We have a fairly good amount of science available for the sea turtles. There are about 100 plus sea turtles tagged by Wildlife Institute of India, and we have tracked its movement for almost a decade. And you can see all these black pop-ups. You see this is the sea turtle movement happening from the nesting areas in Orissa. Then they go all the way to the foraging areas, to various coastal parts, all the way to Sri Lanka, and the population moves towards the Andaman Nicobar. There is one population of olive ridleys which nest in southern part of Sri Lanka, but that doesn't mix with the population that we have in India. This population goes to the west coast, rather to the western Indian Ocean part, to Maldives, Lakshadweep, and Kerala in this part. So very interesting science. Plenty of science we have available for this species. However, when we are planning projects like either Setu Samudram, ship canal, or whether allocating oil and gas blocks under new exploration licensing policy. None of this science has been taken into account when these decisions are made. And therefore, all these projects, and there are plenty of it, I just picked up these two examples, but I can give another 30, 40 examples that I know of. So therefore, the conflict between conservation groups who are trying to save Oleo Ridleys, which is a phenomena that we should be proud of as a nation, because this phenomena happens only in two places on earth, and of which one is in India. And then our developmental goals and agenda that completely overlooks this very bare necessity of movement of these animals into this. See, absolute overlap of sea turtle vis-a-vis either our oil and gas exploration or the transshipment that's been proposed as a part of ship canals. This is another interesting case study. I'm going to speak about Mumbai. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the setting of the Mumbai, but it's much complicated city than Delhi. Delhi can actually grow, in multiple directions. Mumbai can grow only linearly. There is no other way Mumbai can grow unless you have a east-west connectivity, what we call it as, from the eastern seafront to the areas beyond eastern seafront goes to Uran, Navi Mumbai, and so on and so forth. I don't know whether you are able to see my arrow. I'm trying to explain through arrow if it is helpful to you. Now, unless that connectivity is maintained, is going to be very difficult for Mumbai to. It's already a saturated city. Look at where the Navi Mumbai International Airport is proposed. You can see that yellow kind of a hexagonal grid that you can see here, which is surrounded by these blue circles and the red and green circle. Now, this airport site is located amidst a number of important wetlands, which I have shown through the blue circle. Now, these wetlands are not ordinary wetlands, and I'm going to show you through some of the slides why these are extraordinary wetlands. And then the red circles again are very important for these migratory birds point of view. So these blue circles are essentially the feeding areas which these birds use, while as the red circles are where they rest during the high tide time. That's a bit complicated. I will not dwell into that much, but I want to show you why these wetlands are important. This is right backyard of NRI colony, what we know as non-residential Indian colony in Navi Mumbai area. 125,000 flamingos. You can see all those pink dots. Every single dot is a flamingo. That's the level of congregation of birds we get in these wetlands. Now, these birds come here for two purposes. In this particular wetland, they come for resting. But if you see the previous slide, all other important areas where my cursor is moving, the mudflats which get exposed during low tide, they use for feeding. Now, if you want to plan any developmental activity into this seascape and landscape, you obviously have huge challenges, because you do not want to destroy this natural wonder where such a large congregation of flamingos occur every year. And these are migratory birds. And these are not just flamingos which occupy these wetlands. There are more than 500,000 migratory birds which breed in Arctic Russia. They travel all the way from those regions for the feeding purpose to some of these important wetlands. Now, when you have, and these are the flocks I'm talking about, migratory birds, you'll get right in the backyard of Mumbai. That's the spectacular biodiversity we have, we call urban biodiversity, right in the heart of one of the most populated cities of the country. Now, what happens when you, and what is the reason behind this extraordinary congregation? I think we need to demystify this very otherwise seemingly complicated subject into simple fashion for policy point of view. Now, what has happened? One of the reasons, I mean, was there this kind of number of birds available in the past? Probably no. We had roughly about 8,000 birds when we recorded about some 15 years ago for the first time. And that time it was said, oh, what a lovely congregation. Now we have about 150,000. It has increased exponentially. What has facilitated this exponential increase in the population of these beautiful birds? I think there is a complex science in that. What happened is, over a course of last 3 or 4 decades, and that's the Thane Creek area, you can see where my cursor is going. Then there is a BARC, which is at the confluence of this junction, and then it goes into Shivdi area that follows the Mumbai Port Trust area, and then the what we call it as the Gateway of India area. And the right hand side is the JNPT and the new ports that are likely to come up there. That's Uran and Navi Mumbai area. So what happens is that because this is a very shallow bay area and it has a very low tidal amplitude, over a course of time, the lot of this creek area has been taken over by the sediment. And sediment come from two sources. One, because of deforestation on the land, and secondly, because of the currents that will take up during high and low tide. This area was never dredged. Ideally, they should have been dredging this area because this area also is a very important water drainage area during or flood drainage area during the monsoon time for Mumbai, which takes a lot of water during rains back to the sea. But because nobody has bothered to dredge this for 2 or 3 decades, this becomes shallower, shallower, and shallower. It has become now so shallow that except few hundred meters in the central part of it, you can actually walk from one end to other end during the extreme low tides, at least in the narrower part of the creek. Now, this extension and this sediments that has been accumulated over a time in Thane Creek itself, the total sedimentation area or mudflat area has increased to 24 square kilometer. And for the entire eastern seafront, almost 47 square kilometer of water got replaced by the sediment. So all the red that you see all along the creek going up to Thane Creek on the other side is the newly developed mudflat. And if you see the overlap of reduction in water and increasing mudflat, in 2005, our flamingo population was roughly about 20,000, 18,000 or so. From 2005 to 2020, I have not added 20 figure, but it has gone to almost 150,000. Now that has crossed, the threshold exponentially. So the entire increase in the population of flamingos and migratory water birds is directly attributed to the very large mudflat areas that got formed over a course of last 20 years. But there is still a myth that these are unique mudflats. I think there is nothing unique about this mudflat. We have got, and I'll show you one slide of how much of mudflats we have both on east and west coast of India. And the reality is that these are the most polluted mudflats. In fact, it receives all kinds of toxic discharge from the industries that are there in Thane and Navi Mumbai area. There is a lot of warm water that has been released from a power plant that we have in this area. A lot of raw sewage getting discharged into this area. And the reality is that these becomes unique mudflats not because they're simply good mudflats, but their biological productivity of benthos is extremely high. And why it is high? Because of simple biological, what we call it as phenomena, that warm water and raw sewage is super recipe for very high productivity. And these birds are coming here not for the not for the flats. These flamingos and other waders are coming here because of the abundant food that is available into this place. Now, the risk that is happening today, that we may on one side completely oppose all industrial development in that area. That's great. I have no problem. If there's no industry there, that's good. But we are not addressing the right issue into this area. That we are exposing these birds, large population of birds, to extremely toxic food source. Now, what will happen over a course of time? And surely it will happen because that's a biological reality, what we call it as bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Because there is so much of accumulation of metals and other toxic elements into the benthic organism on which this flamingo feed. Flamingo over a course of time, I don't know what that time could be, maybe 20 year, 30 year, 40 year. That's another area of research, but they will have compromised what we call it as a population in terms of its loss in reproductive ability or getting extremely sick and not able to survive. The real challenge, therefore, for us to make sure that these mudflats are cleaned up out of pollution by effective means and mechanism, and then look at how we can make a win-win situation both for the birds as well as for the development. If you look at the number of the scale of mudflat that's available across India, in coastal wetlands, which include some of the mudflats also, almost 4 million hectare, and intertidal mudflat about 2.4 million hectare. So this is a huge natural ecosystem that is available where these birds can go. That's why I'm saying it's not the shortage of habitat. I think it's the abundance of food. That's what is facilitating the growth of benthos, which is attracting this large number of birds. The third case study which I'm going to speak about is the human-wildlife conflict. Through again, another case study that we have been tracking and we have been speaking and writing about and fighting for. Now, this is a very small area in central India in Maharashtra called Chandrapur district, where we have got very famous tiger reserve called Tadoba Andhari Tiger Reserve. And all this green, what you see on left side image, is the Tadoba Andhari Tiger Reserve. And you can see again in this image, there is very thin green line that is connecting north of it going eastward side, and that connects Tadoba Andhari Tiger Reserve to the larger landscape, which you can see again on two other sides to Brahmapuri division. Then it goes further continuation to Gadchiroli MP, and that's how the animals disperse from this area, which is very well protected outside. What you can see on right hand side, two maps, one on top and one in below. The top one, that's where the tiger has killed human beings in and around Tadoba Tiger Reserve and into its corridor area. The lower image is where tiger have injured animals, but no fatality. And if you see today, the dilemma for us, for both for tiger as well as conservation as well as development. Unfortunately, what is happening, and the conservation area that we are currently battling strongly with state government, is that there was a proposal to develop a small irrigation project in this area. And if you can see the small black arrow-like thing just below the red where my cursor is, that's the wall of the dam that was proposed as a minor irrigation project. And the original idea, it is an old proposal way back in 1980s. And 1980s, probably there were not so many tigers in Tadoba Andhari. There were only probably 20, 30 odd individuals. Now there are 100 plus tigers into this landscape, more than that. And the purpose of that is called Human Dam. And the purpose was to provide irrigation water to downstream to the villages out there. Had this been built in 1980, things would have been very different. For whatever reason, it was never built that time. Now contexts have changed because in last 2.5 or 3 decades, because of very strong conservation measures taken by government of Maharashtra, tiger population here has gone exponentially up. I remember when I used to go to take school groups here, we used to walk in this forest without any problem. Today, you can't even dream of walking in this forest. There are so many tigers into this landscape. Now, what has happened? What is going to happen if this dam comes here? This dam will disconnect this last remaining corridor of Tadoba to the Chandrapur division. Now, if you can see where my cursor is moving, that whole red is a submergence area, the blue is a submergence area proposed of this proposed irrigation project. If this gets fragmented, if this corridor gets cut because it gets submerged in water, it means Tadoba become perpetually isolated from rest of the forest landscape into central India. And what will then happen to the tigers? Tigers is a territorial animal. Today we have problem only in one area. And if you see these two maps on the right hand side, there are very less conflict areas on the left of TITR, where my cursor is. There are very few casualties. There are very few injuries because tiger per se is not habitual to kill a human being. Most of the conflict is with the dispersing tiger. What is a dispersing tiger? The tiger is a territorial animal. You can only have X number of adult tigers into this landscape. Anything more than that, they will have territorial fights, and sometimes, rather most of the time, these fights can be fatal. Therefore, young tigers which keep producing in this area, because there are now so many male and females within this area, that they have to find new territories. And to find new territories, they have to leave this forest block and go outside. And when they start going outside, that is where their interaction with people is far more. And that is the key issue for conservation of this landscape. That is why this entire conflict is because of this dispersing tiger. And now it's not just the dispersing tiger, there are so many tigers that outside also become a breeding population hub for the tiger. But what will happen if this corridor gets cut? If this corridor gets cut, then obviously this conflict to a certain extent might get reduced, but it's not that the conflict is going to get reduced. The conflict is going to shift to another area of the park where people are not at all used to presence of tiger in this large number. So we are only helping shift a problem from one area to other area without known consequences of that shift can happen. Therefore, what we have said to state government, and that is where I believe working with states and central is very, very important. We said if you shift this by about 3 kilometers, maybe your catchment will reduce, maybe your storage capacity will reduce a bit, but you will still have a reservoir. It will still supply water to, if not 100%, to at least 70% of the catchment requirement, and yet you can protect the corridor so that tiger can still move, disperse into a larger landscape. Now, unless you create this win-win situation, our conflict, human-wildlife conflict, are only going to increase manifold. COVID-19 is a classic case of human-wildlife conflict. We know it has emerged from wildlife, whether it's from bat or from bat to pangolin, pangolin to human, is subject to detailed scientific study. I'm not expert on that subject, so I will not comment on that. But it certainly evolved from wildlife. And our continued and increased exposure to wildlife in years to come, as our forests will get fragmented because of population, because of roads, because of canals, because of railway tracks, and so on and so forth, our exposure to zoonotics is only going to increase in years to come. And it's not that only tigers are going out and dispersing into the newer areas. People are going into the heart of the forest areas for collection of minor forest produce for their livelihood. So that the irony is that you have two levels of conflict: a conflict of tiger going out to establish its own territory and interacting with human beings, sometimes with fatally, sometimes not so fatally. At the same time, people going inside the forest and interacting with the wild animals inside the forest, causing either fatally or non-fatally. Now, I think this requires a much more holistic, broader approach for conservation. Otherwise, and despite all this conflict, people are still extremely tolerant for tiger and leopard. Even today, if you go into these villages, all they will say, you make sure that tiger don't kill human beings, otherwise tiger hai to jungle hai. That's an attitude even today these people have who lost members of their family. And we have to salute for the spirit of these people, that even today they are not going into the way that we have seen what happened in Kerala, for that elephant or some other parts where people become almost mercenaries for wildlife. In that sense, we still have communities staying around protected areas, extremely tolerant and accommodative for our wildlife, and we have to make them a strong partner in conservation rather than talking about their displacement, not giving them their due rights, because that's not good for conservation point of view. The fourth case study I'm going to speak about bird migration, extraordinary phenomena, that how these birds actually navigate and circumvent various parts of the world for either nesting or for foraging, or rather feeding. And I'm not going to go into very technical detail of bird migration. I'm only going to show, if you see the left hand side, there are two maps, and the bulk of the birds that we get in. Yeah, sorry.
Excuse me, sir. May I interrupt you? I think your slides are not moving.
No, I'm not. So you are not seeing my bird migration slide?
No.
Which one you have?
So we are seeing the India map with Garland coastal region.
Oh, seriously?
Yes, sir. Now it's moving. Now it's moving. Yeah.
Now it is
bird
there.
migration slide. Yeah.
So all previous slides you have not seen?
Yes.
Till now we have been seeing same one.
Slide number 8 for a long time.
Shall I just quickly show you the slide so that you get a pulse of it?
Yeah,
sure.
That is slide number 8, 221.
Yeah, okay. Have you seen this slide?
Yes.
No.
Okay. All.
And it's fine.
Yeah. After that was this one, and then
Yes.
this conflict, right? Okay, this is the Bhitarkanika. I'm talking about the large congregation of sea turtles come for nesting, which I spoke about. And then how the satellite tagged turtles give us a good idea about these black dots are the turtles tagged in Orissa, going all the way to Sri Lanka and going to Andaman. And the red one, which were tagged in Sri Lanka, going to the Western Indian Ocean, to Maldives, Lakshadweep, and Kerala. And then how these various projects, either Setu Samudram Ship Canal or new exploration policy, overlap with the sea turtle congregation that I was talking about, not inclusion of science into it. Then I spoke about urban biodiversity. That's a seascape I'm talking about. Can you see the slide now clearly?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Beautiful
All right.
slides.
Now, and the yellow one is actually the Navi Mumbai International Airport. These blue circles and red circles are the one which are the important key wetlands. And that's how you can see the congregation of flamingos into this wetland. 150,000, this tiny pink dot. Every single dot is every single flamingo. In Talaude wetland, it's just one wetland in Mumbai, which we recently counted during the lockdown time. And these are the migratory birds visit some of the wetlands in Mumbai. So these are some extraordinary mudflats that we have. And you've seen this map which I talked about, how that red along the creek is where the additional mudflats have been formed over a course of last almost 30 years. It has reduced 47 square kilometer of water. It means it has added 47 square kilometer of a mudflat in the entire seafront. So there is an abundant mudflat available. And this is not just, and it's directly attributed. If you see the flamingo population from 2005 to 2019 and 2020 is much above this, has exponentially increased directly with increase into the mudflats as well as mudflat productivity. And then I spoke about how these mudflats are polluted and why we need to really look at this into a different context. And these are the wetlands and mudflats that we have in India, about 4 million hectares of coastal wetlands and about 2.4 million hectares of intertidal mudflats. That's the landscape I talk about human-wildlife conflict in Tadoba. If you can see the entire green is the Tadoba, on left-hand side is Tadoba Andhari Tiger Reserve. And this small green strip going north is that small corridor that I talked about. And in between there is a human dam. You can see a black arrow kind of stuff just next to that red. Now that's the entire corridor is under submergence if this irrigation canal comes. And on right-hand side, I have two slides which show the conflict area. The upper one with the red dots are all human casualties because of tiger, and lower images are the injuries that are not fatal. And I said about how if this corridor get disrupted completely, then this movement of tigers from Tadoba to the entire larger landscape outside will get curtailed, and that movement of tiger may shift into other side of the landscape, which is more catastrophic because there is a lot more population into this area on the left hand side compared to where they are currently dispersing now. And this is a larger picture where these tigers then move all the way up to MP and further as they get the forest corridors. So you got good pictorial view of what I have said so far. I should have said me earlier. And that's the last slide I have showed before I come to bird migration is how people are moving. This is something which we are working currently, understanding the utilization pattern of natural resource utilization pattern by the local communities around TATR. So there is a two-way interaction. One interaction when tiger move out of a forest and it interact with people when people are in villages. And when people go inside forest, there is an interaction of animals with people when they go inside the forest. So it's a double-edged sword in terms of conservation mitigation. And then bird migration, if you see the left-hand side two images, that most of the birds, migratory water birds that you can see on right-hand side upper image, these are all waders, what we call. They all breed in Arctic Russia, and they don't breed in India. So there are no breeding habitat for these species in India. They all breed in a colder region of Arctic Russia, but they travel all the way to India during the winter in this Arctic region where it is very cold and no food available. While at the same time in India that time it's a winter season which is very mild and abundant food is available. So that's the migration where I stopped previously, and I'll proceed now with my presentation with that. Now look at some of these marathon flyers and swimmers that we have. On left hand side we have a very tiny bird, 110 gram Arctic tern. It makes the longest annual migration in the world, and it makes an annual round trip of 71,000 kilometers from Arctic to Antarctic every year. How phenomenal is that for such a tiny bird to fly that distance every year after year? from nesting to foraging areas. And the image on right hand side is a bar-tailed godwit. This bird was satellite tagged in New Zealand, and it went number of trips. And one trip they tracked it from 9 days non-stop flight, 11,500 kilometers from Alaska to New. It's not just the flight that amazed us; it also amazed us in terms of what kind of perilous journeys these birds undertake over the course of migration, because it's all along the flyway there is a hunting of birds, habitat degradation is there, all kind of adverse environment they will face through either storms or bad weather or clouds or rains and all that kind of stuff. Despite all that, these birds generation after generation making this long haul migration, and that's unless protect their nesting site, their resting site, and their feeding site, these migratory birds has no future. And fortunately, this time when Government of India hosted the CMS, Convention on Migration in Gandhinagar, our Honorable Prime Minister had made his intent very clear that Government of India will take a proactive role in conservation of this migratory water Central Asian flyway. And now we are in a very advanced stage of establishment secretariat with the CMS, Convention on Migratory Secretariat, so that some very concrete action, conservation of cotton roosting and feeding area. And it's not just the birds. There are a whole range of other animals also migrate. Now, humpback whale are known to migrate to almost 25,000 kilometers from Antarctica to Pacific Ocean. The northern elephant seal about 21,000 kilometers from Mexico to Gulf of Alaska. Leatherback turtles almost 20,000 kilometers. And there's a beautiful study done in India by one of our researchers who unravel the beautiful migration of it. And size doesn't matter. It doesn't need to be very big to do migration. Look at how tiny animals migrate what distance. Dragonflies, 17,000 kilometers. There's one species we have in Western Ghat, globe skimmer, 18,000 kilometers from India to Maldives, Seychelles to Mozambique, all the way to Uganda. Monarch butterfly, which is butterflies, as you know, are extremely delicate, can take migration of about 1,000 kilometers from Mexico to US. Northern whittier, a tiny bird, 7,200 kilometers, and I can give you hundreds and hundreds of examples where these animals take extraordinary movement, migration from one place to other place. What prompts it, how they navigate, their ways out with ever-changing landscape and seascape is something which is even today beyond comprehension of our intelligence. But these animals keep coming, keep moving year after year. That is the beauty of nature. That's what we need. There's another case I'm going to present on linear. Very interesting because you have policies which are very, very important. And many a times believe that the linear doesn't have much of, because we go in straight line, we don't take much of forest, don't take much of, but that project fragment forest more than any other project, because you fragment over a very long distances of hundreds and of kilometers. And therefore, if linear projects are not take into account this search of our wildlife habitat, then to leave the kind of impact otherwise will never be able to mitigate. I think what happens today, the guidelines provided by Wildlife Institute of India, today people believe that it's a Bible that you can use that and build highways wherever you want, whether it's protected area or wetland or watershed and so on. I think that's a very wrong approach to look at building roads or building railways or building canals or transmission lines. Unless we'll, and there is no one uniform solution. You have to go site. Every site has to be in this context. Whether there is, and as I said, corridor need not be very large. The slide I have shown you for Toba, that corridor in terms of width is only 1 kilometer and length is only about 8 kilometers. So it cannot be very large corridor we are talking. Sometimes the corridors can be very small, but they are what we call it as a bottleneck corridor. And I think with CRRI, somewhere in their policy, this kind of a grade gives you first-hand idea is where are those bottlenecks, where are the other important corridors, be it for tigers, for elephants, be it for endangered birds. And that decision will help you design and develop policies for India more robustly than not having this in. Because by the time all the design, then comes the environment. That's the wrong thing. I think environment should be first in terms of planning the linear or the alignment, and then look at the draft environmental impact assessment notification. It says saying that currently, for example, highway over 30-kilometer highway, additional ROW of 20. Those amendments suggest 100-kilometer and 70. It means virtually nothing can come to category for environmental scrutiny at the environmental if this amendment. And that's precedent. I think for the sake of development, we cannot compromise the biodiversity. Otherwise, it will hit. Look at, for example, PWL clearance to the railway line. It will Western Ghat will cut about 2.5 degrees and it passes through. We already animals have died. For example, and that's the parliament response, which we have with us is 62 elephants died between just 4 years. By mostly in West Bengal, Orissa, and northeastern part of. Now that's an absolute that animals just because we have thought into their corridor or movement areas. For example, killed 60 elephant and 8 tigers in last 3 years. And so number of large mammals continue to die, and not just on railway lines, roads, on execution, and so on. Therefore, it has to be very systematically if you want to avoid. I don't think anybody intentionally do that. I think the lack of that support system that you have probably will lead to some of the very unplanned development. It is important that this decision support system. And when we spoke to the Rajasthan Forest Department, for example, that's a Great Indian Bustard, only 100 birds left all over the world. That's the population we have, and we are blessed that this species exists in India, in Rajasthan and Gujarat, that they are today dying because of collision to transmission, because of solar and wind power. And therefore, government of Rajasthan taking cognizance of this issue has said that all transmission lines therefore should be retrofitted and made underground to avoid bird collision. We have options if we take decisions at right time. This decision should have been taken. Nonetheless, even if we have 100 birds, still the population can recover if we can make that area transition free for the birds to fly and continue to habitat. And the last and the important issue I'm going to speak on 5 to 7 minutes is the climate change. Climate change is one of all conservation issues. This one issue has ability to influence vast population in very short period of time. And we are seeing the stories of nature vagaries in last few years as to how nature is getting unpredictable day by day, year by year. And what happened in the last 4 months itself is coming to us from the climate. And this slide, for some, it's great joy that they're able to see during the monsoon. But as a climate scientist, it worries me most because this is a symptom. When a patient go to doctor, there may be a kind of sigh of relief on the patient. Okay, I have a minor and that doctor no patient has got a problem, and if this is not, it will go gangrene. That's it. So void today can be images of tragedy in another 2 or 3 decades. Sea level rise is not met. It agrees bureaucracy that or not, it doesn't be changing rapidly. It is happening right now, and hundreds of examples in India. Forget about outside. That how we are signature level rise. I'll see just one slide. And I can probably, if you have time, next time I'll show you another 20 slides. This is one small creek, a tiny creek in Maharashtra, which we have seen. Look at the left side image in 1990. All was green. Very few was red. That red was a mangrove, which is a foreshore, what we call it as vegetation in the creek areas. Look at 2019. Almost 60 square kilometer of cultivable paddy land is taken over by mangroves because of the water increase. Now, as a conservation group, I'm extremely happy because mangrove have increased by 60 square kilometer. When we are talking about tree cutting here and there, it's a large tract of mangroves have come up over a course of just 20 years, 2 decades. But we created another set of conflict here, that what a agrarian person, what a farmer will do when his productive agriculture land is taken over by salinity and mangrove, when he cannot cut mangrove because mangrove now is a forest. So he lost his land, he lost his livelihood. So you created one more element of enemy for nature conservation. And unless we make a fundamental policy reform into this to make sure is how that farmer can get a mangrove-based livelihood, so his land remain intact, the mangrove remain intact, yet the farmer will be able to do farming, but of a different nature. I think unless we explore these avenues of building human resilience to this changing reality, we only will have conflict in years to come. And our intervention, of course, has its consequences. Now, for example, for containing erosion, we have put tetrapods into many places. Now, tetrapods are not really the solution. But what happened is it never contained the erosion, but it has reduced, it has declined nesting of green and hawksbill turtles in the Lakshadweep, because turtles have to travel from water all the way up to beyond high tide into sandy areas for nesting, which they are not able to do. Now, these are some very unscientific interventions, very casual intervention, but caused irreplaceable damage to some of the most spectacular animals in the watery domain. And I'm going to speak just on last 3 or 4 slides, elevated sea surface temperature and coral reef. This is slightly complicated than what you can otherwise understand very easily. So I'm not going to dwell upon much on this. What happens is that in seas, in coral reef areas, for example, in Lakshadweep or Andaman or Gulf of Kutch, these animals have got a microscopic algae in its body called zooxanthellae. And because of this zooxanthellae, and get beautiful colors. You see this image clams, lower clam, deep blue you can see is because of that algae. And when that algae leaves this animal, because of higher sea surface temperature, it becomes white, like a white lipstick. I'm not going to dwell upon El Nino and all elevated sea surface temperature and that, because that's extremely scientific. But we have a data since 1990s where our baseline sea surface temperature was ranging between 26 to 28, which is a very safe temperature range for most of the marine organisms. Coral reef also do extremely fine in this temperature regime. Their growth is great. Zooxanthellae like that temperature. So the coral reef were very extremely healthy when these baselines were between 26 and 28. But look at how this graph shifted since 1990 and especially after 2000. Now the baseline of this sea surface temperature has almost settled just below 29 to 30 degrees centigrade. Now that's an extremely risky position, because all corals will start bleaching at 29 degrees centigrade. They simply cannot tolerate sea surface temperature more than 29 degrees centigrade. And the clams do not tolerate temperature above 30. So what will happen? If this thermal threshold, what we call it as thermal maxima, if it is settled at 29, irrespective of El Nino, all these ecosystems will affect seriously because of surface temperature. And that is a great cause of concern to us, because millions and millions of people globally depend on this coral reef for their livelihood. In nature's point of view, if you take out a human being from the nature, then for nature it's a simple ecosystem shift. If this hard coral die out, it will be taken over by some other species. In Lakshadweep, we have seen that in 1999, when major bleaching happened, instead of hard coral, a lot of soft coral, because soft coral don't require zooxanthellae, they don't require much of sunlight, they can thrive very well, their deep water species adapt very well. So there is an ecosystem shift. It's a common ecological concept that in nature. So nature will respond it in a very its own fashion, and probably things will not make any difference in nature because nature has far greater violent episodes on formation than smaller events. I think this matters to us most because our lives are intricately associated with this ecosystem. And it's not just the ecosystem. El Nino and El Nino also influence rains annually. In precipitation depends on El Nino or La Nina. So whether it will be a drought season or excessive rain season or optimal rain season, it all depends on this sea surface temperature behavior. Therefore, any policy that we want to draft, which is divorced from each other, and it's very important for us again understand scientifically that whatever happen on land, the influence of what happens in ocean. And we have absolute misconception. We keep talking about, for example, I was listening to the other day presentation on interlinking of river and saying that look, oh, they're building dams, for all these rivers because the wastage of fresh water going into sea. All these people speaking this nonsense not understand that survival of ocean depends on this fresh water going to the sea, because this is not just water which goes from our forest and our mountains to the sea. It takes along with it very rich nutrients that make this sea productive. And unless you understand this very fine balance that nature has struck over a course of its millions of years of evolution, and by cutting down this water to the sea, it's like शेख चिल्ली वाली कहानी जो अपने ही पैर पे हम लोग कुल्हाड़ी मारने की बात कर रहे हैं, for not understanding a very complex science and interaction of land and sea. And therefore, I think conservation today can no longer be divorced from economic and political context. We have a strong science. We have some of the finest scientists that you can recall, not just in conservation, but all kinds of disciplines of science and engineering. But rarely that science. I think time has come that science there should be it should not divorce from. I think science, the social, the political context has to be brought in, make a meaningful dialogue for both conservation as well as development. Unless that happens, we will suffer because of climate. And this COVID-19 is just a trailer. I think there are far larger super monsters waiting to come. And our casual approach with nature. And I'll stop here. If there are any questions, I'll be very happy to. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for enlightening us, and it was indeed an excellent and very informative presentation. Thank you so much, sir. Now I request our director to present a memento to our chief guest as a token of love and appreciation.
Oh, that's a great idea. Virtual.
Remove this screen, Vivek. Dr. Deepak, it was fantastic lecture, and I would say that it was not you, but your experience was speaking, because you have done so extensively in this field. Now I'm just presenting a very virtual memento to you, and we will certainly try to deliver at in your office. Yeah, Dubey.
एक मिनट सर प्ले नहीं हो रहा है.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's lovely. It's the first time I got this. Thank you, sir. Pleasure.
Now I request Dr. Ravinder, K. Ravinder, to please propose a vote of thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. Respected chief guest of this function, Dr. Deepak Apte, Director BNHS, and respected Director CRRI, Professor Satish Chandra, and my dear colleagues who are on the panel as well as the participants. It's a great honor was to be with us Dr. Deepak Apte to accept our invitation and given is a very enlightened lecture. So it's very interesting, though there are so many worries from the participants. You have enlightened on various issues such as biodiversity in India and the climate changes in India and the ecosystem shift. So is nowadays you also spoken about the linking of rivers. What would be the effect on the biodiversity as well as our CRZ zone areas? And it's a very interesting lecture, sir. On behalf of CRRI, CSIR CRRI, and on my own behalf, I would like to propose a vote of thanks. So thank you very much, sir, for your nice lecture. So it is a big round of applause. And the next vote of thanks goes to our director, Professor Satish Chandra, being very busy schedule in the webinars today. He take it out of time and given the encouragement. And interestingly, we can see very good memento also is shown through the online. Thank you, sir, for your great guidance and the support you are all the way giving. And I would like to thank Dr. Anuradha Shukla, nicely narrating the works and the projects studies which we are done in the past as well as the presently doing studies. Thank you, madam, for your nice narration. She deserves a big round of applause. I would like to thank Dr. Neelam J. Gupta, head ILT, and Sri Vivek Dubey and the CCN to coordinate this program through online. So he also deserves a big round of applause. And the last, but least, the participants who are logged in to see this program. And in this during COVID days, one big advantage, that is the technology which we are using. I think thanks goes to the technology developed as well as we using. So thank you for one and all for the nice lecture. Thank you.
So now we are closing today's event. और आप सभी की चाय तो ड्यू रही. Stay safe
Virtual tea.
and take good care of yourself. Namaskar.
Thank you.
Thank you.